Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Facts channel. I'm so glad you found your way here. Maybe you had a long day. Or maybe you're the kind of person who likes falling asleep to underwater mysteries rather than counting sheep. Either way, tonight's journey is for you. Let your mind relax, your breathing slow, and your body grow light as a bubble rising through warm tropical waters. Because tonight, we're exploring coral reefs, those ancient underwater cities, built by creatures smaller than your fingernail. We'll drift from their rainbow colors to their patient construction spanning centuries, discovering how these living stones create homes for a quarter of all ocean life. Some of what you hear tonight may surprise you, or at least spark curiosity as you drift off. Before we begin, if this helps you unwind, consider liking and subscribing. One sleepy soul at a time. Now, let's begin. Coral reefs are not plants, but rather colonies of tiny animals called polyps, each one being a soft-bodied creature, no larger than a pinhead, living in a limestone cup that it secretes around itself for protection. These polyps are related to jellyfish and sea anemones, sharing the same basic body plan with a central mouth surrounded by tentacles that wave gently in the current, capturing microscopic food particles that drift past. The polyp extends its tentacles primarily at night, when plankton rises from the deep ocean, the tiny arms swaying in darkness, like flowers opening to moonlight, each one equipped with stinging cells that paralyze prey too small for human eyes to see. During daylight hours, the polyps retract into their limestone cups, creating the hard surface we recognize as coral, though the living tissue remains just beneath, a thin layer of life covering stone. The limestone skeleton that the polyp creates is built gradually from calcium carbonate, extracted from seawater, the polyp taking dissolved minerals and transforming them into solid structure, building its protective home molecule by molecule. This construction happens so slowly that individual polyps add only fractions of an inch per year to the reef structure. Yet over centuries and millennia, these patient builders create formations that can be seen from space, their accumulated efforts, becoming mountains beneath the waves. The coral polyp lives its entire life in the spot where it first settled as a larva, never moving from its limestone cup, experiencing the ocean only through what flows past on the current, the polyp being simultaneously builder and resident, architect and inhabitant of these underwater cities. The Great Barrier Reef stretches for over 1,400 miles along the northeastern coast of Australia, making it the largest living structure on Earth, visible from orbit as a pale line separating the deep blue ocean from the lighter waters of the continental shelf. This immense reef system is not a single continuous structure, but rather a complex of nearly 3,000 individual reefs and 900 islands, each one separated by channels and passages, where currents flow between the reef and the open ocean. The reef began forming around 20 million years ago, when the Australian continental plate drifted into tropical waters, creating conditions suitable for coral growth. Though the current reef structure is much younger, most of it having grown during the past 9,000 years since sea levels stabilized after the last ice age. The reef provides habitat for an estimated 1,500 species of fish, more than 400 species of coral, 4,000 species of mollusks, and countless other organisms from sponges to sea turtles, this diversity making it one of the most complex ecosystems on the planet. The Great Barrier Reef generates billions of dollars in tourism revenue each year, while also protecting the Australian coastline from wave erosion and storm damage, the reef absorbing wave energy and reducing the force of water that reaches the shore. The reef faces challenges from rising ocean temperatures, ocean acidification, and human activities including coastal development and fishing, these pressures threatening to alter the reef faster than it can adapt or recover. Yet the reef persists, growing slowly in some areas while declining in others. The living structure constantly changing in response to conditions. Polyps building new limestone even as old sections erode. The reef being not a static monument, but a living process. Growth and decay, balanced in patient rhythm across centuries. Coral polyps cannot build reefs alone, but rather depend on microscopic algae, called zooxanthellae, that live within their tissues. these single-celled organisms residing inside the polyp's cells in a partnership that benefits both participants. The zooxanthellae are photosynthetic, using sunlight to produce sugars and oxygen just as plants do, these products being shared with the coral polyp that provides the algae with shelter and access to nutrients from its waste. This symbiotic relationship provides up to 90% of the energy that coral polyps need to survive and build their limestone skeletons. The algae, essentially farming sunlight and sharing the harvest with their hosts. The zooxanthellae give coral its characteristic colors, different species of algae producing different pigments that range from golden brown to green. These colors, making healthy coral reefs, appear as underwater rainbows. The algae require sunlight to photosynthesize, which is why reef-building corals grow only in shallow, clear water where light penetrates, typically in depths of less than 150 feet, though some species can survive deeper in exceptionally clear water. The partnership between coral and algae is ancient, having evolved over millions of years, the two organisms becoming so interdependent that neither can thrive without the other in reef environments. The algae population within coral tissue is dynamic, with cells dividing and being expelled regularly. The coral maintaining a balance of algae that maximizes energy production without being overwhelmed. This delicate relationship makes corals vulnerable to environmental stress because when water becomes too warm or conditions otherwise deteriorate, the coral expels its algae in a response called bleaching, the loss of algae leaving the coral white and deprived of its major energy source. The polyps surviving for weeks or months on captured plankton alone but eventually starving if the algae do not return. Coral reefs grow in tropical and subtropical waters where temperatures remain between 70 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, these warm, stable conditions being essential for the metabolic processes that allow polyps to build limestone skeletons efficiently. The reefs require clear water with low nutrient levels. This seemingly contradictory requirement existing because high nutrient levels promote algae growth in the water column, these free-floating algae blocking sunlight that the coral's zooxanthellae need for photosynthesis. The water must also be well oxygenated and have normal ocean salinity. Coral polyps being sensitive to freshwater input from rivers that can lower salinity and increase sediment that smothers the reef. Coral reefs therefore develop primarily on the eastern edges of continents and around oceanic islands, where these conditions coincide, the western edges of oceans typically being too cold due to currents bringing water from polar regions. The depth limitation means that reefs require some sort of foundation near the surface, growing on submerged rock, on the remains of older reefs, or on volcanic islands, the coral building upward from these substrates toward the light. As coral grows, it creates complex three-dimensional structure, with caves, overhangs, channels, and crevices. This physical complexity, providing countless hiding places and varied habitats that allow thousands of species to coexist in the same area. The reef structure modifies water flow, creating areas of calm water and areas where currents accelerate these flow patterns, influencing where different species settle and determining which areas receive the most food delivery from passing currents. The reef continues growing as long as conditions remain suitable, building upward and outward in patient expansion. Though growth rates vary with species and location, the fastest growing corals, adding several inches per year, while slower species measure their growth in fractions of an inch, all of them contributing to the reef's gradual accumulation over time. The process of coral reproduction reveals the remarkable coordination occurring within reef ecosystems, with many coral species spawning simultaneously during specific nights each year, releasing eggs and sperm into the water in synchrony that depends on lunar cycles, water temperature, and day length. This mass spawning typically occurs a few nights after a full moon during summer months, the timing varying by location, but being remarkably predictable for each reef. Scientists able to forecast spawning events months in advance, based on environmental conditions. The synchrony ensures that eggs and sperm from different colonies meet in the water, increasing fertilization. Success, millions of coral polyps releasing their gametes within hours of each other, the water becoming cloudy with the reproductive cells that drift on currents. The fertilized eggs develop into tiny larvae called planulae. These microscopic swimming stages drifting with ocean currents for days or weeks, traveling far from their parent colonies before settling on hard substrate to begin their own lives. The planula is covered with tiny hairs called cilia that beat in coordinated waves, propelling the larva through water as it searches for suitable settlement sites, the larva being able to delay settlement if it doesn't encounter appropriate conditions, remaining in the plankton and continuing its search. When the planula finds suitable substrate, it settles and transforms, cementing itself to the rock and metamorphosing into a polyp, immediately beginning to secrete its limestone cup, the first step in what may become centuries of growth. The newly settled polyp begins budding, producing genetically identical copies of itself that remain connected to the original, the colony growing as polyps divide and divide again, thousands or millions of individuals, eventually forming what appears to be a single coral head. This colonial growth means that what we perceive as one coral is actually a community of clones, all descended from that single settled larva, working together to build their shared limestone foundation, each polyp contributing to the collective structure, while remaining an individual organism with its own mouth and tentacles. The shapes that corals form reflect their growth strategies and the environmental conditions where they live. Branching corals growing quickly upward to capture light, plate corals forming horizontal surfaces that maximize exposure to sun, massive corals building solid mounds that can withstand wave action. The branching corals like staghorn and elkhorn create intricate structures, resembling tree branches or antlers. These formations growing several inches per year, their open architecture allowing water flow while providing shelter for fish and other creatures among the branches. The plate corals like table corals extend thin sheets outward from a central attachment point. These horizontal surfaces capturing maximum sunlight in deeper waters where light is limited, the thin structure being fragile but efficient for energy collection. The massive or boulder corals like brain coral and star coral grow as solid domes that increase in size gradually, adding layers to their surface year after year. These corals being among the slowest growing but also the most resilient, some individual colonies being hundreds of years old and surviving storm damage that shatters more delicate branching species. The encrusting corals spread across rock surfaces like living paint, their low profile making them resistant to wave action. These corals colonizing areas too turbulent for other growth forms. Each growth form has advantages and disadvantages. The branching corals capturing light efficiently and growing fast, but being vulnerable to breakage. The massive corals being durable but slow. The coral community, containing multiple growth forms, that together create the structural complexity that characterizes healthy reefs. The shapes respond to local conditions. The same species growing as compact branches in areas with strong waves, but forming more open structures in calm waters. The coral's growth being plastic and responsive to its environment. The polyps building structures adapted to the forces they experience. The reef's architecture emerging from countless individual decisions about where to add new limestone. The colors visible on coral reefs come from multiple sources, including the zooxanthellae algae, living within coral tissue, pigments produced by the coral polyps themselves, and the countless other organisms that colonize reef surfaces or live among the coral branches. The zooxanthellae contribute browns, greens, and golden hues depending on their species and density, these photosynthetic pigments serving primarily to capture light for energy production, but incidentally creating color visible to human observers. The coral polyps produce fluorescent proteins that create brilliant blues, greens, pinks, and purples. These proteins possibly protecting the coral from excessive light or ultraviolet radiation, though their exact function remains debated among scientists. The proteins being similar to those used in biological research, where they serve as markers to track processes within cells. The coralline algae that encrusts much of the reef surface contributes pinks and purples. These calcifying algae helping cement the reef structure, while adding their own colors to the palette. The fish, sponges, sea fans, and countless other reef residents each contribute their own colors, creating an overall effect of almost impossible diversity, the reef appearing as an underwater garden, where every surface holds visual interest. The colors serve various functions for reef organisms. Beyond simple decoration, bright colors warning predators of toxicity or distastefulness, camouflage patterns, helping predators ambush prey, or helping prey avoid detection. Brilliant colors, attracting mates, or serving as species recognition signals. The play of light across reef surfaces changes throughout the day as the sun's angle shifts, colors appearing different at dawn than at midday than at dusk, the reef being a dynamic visual environment where light and color interact constantly. At night, the reef transforms, the daytime colors fading to blues and grays in moonlight, but many creatures producing their own light through bioluminescence, creating a different kind of color display, where living organisms generate photons, the reef never truly dark, but rather shifting between solar illumination and biological light, color being a constant presence in reef environments, even when the source changes. The fish that inhabit coral reefs display remarkable diversity in their forms, behaviors, and ecological roles, from tiny gobies, barely an inch long, living in coral crevices, to large groupers, weighing hundreds of pounds, patrolling reef edges. The damselfish aggressively defend small territories on the reef, farming algae within their claimed areas and chasing away much larger fish that venture too close. These tiny farmers maintaining gardens on dead coral surfaces, where they cultivate the specific algae species they prefer. The parrotfish scrape algae from coral surfaces with their beak-like fused teeth, incidentally consuming limestone that they grind with specialized throat teeth, called pharyngeal mills. The limestone being excreted as fine sand that accumulates in reef lagoons and on beaches, each large parrotfish producing hundreds of pounds of sand per year. The cleaner wrasses operate cleaning stations where larger fish come to have parasites removed, the wrasse picking ectoparasites and dead tissue from their clients' bodies, sometimes entering the mouth and gills of predators that could easily consume them. This relationship being so beneficial that both parties respect the arrangement, the client remaining still during cleaning and never attacking the wrasse. The butterfly fish cruise the reef in pairs, picking small invertebrates from crevices with their elongated snouts, these fish being among the most specialized reef feeders, different species targeting different prey and occupying different microhabitats. The diversity of butterfly fish in an area indicating reef health. The groupers lurk in caves and under overhangs during the day, emerging at dawn and dusk to hunt these ambush predators, using sudden bursts of speed to capture prey, their large mouths creating suction that draws victims inward. The grouper's patient waiting being a hunting strategy that requires minimal energy expenditure between meals. The reef fish community contains species filling every imaginable ecological role: herbivores grazing algae, carnivores hunting other fish or invertebrates, planktivores hovering above the reef to catch drifting food, detritivores processing waste and dead material, each species contributing to the reef's function. The fish being not just decorative residents but essential participants in nutrient cycling and energy transfer. The invertebrates that inhabit reefs outnumber the fish species many times over, creating a hidden world of creatures that emerge primarily at night, or that live permanently within coral crevices, their diversity and abundance being staggering, though much of it remains invisible to casual observation. The sea urchins graze algae from reef surfaces, their five-toothed mouth apparatus, called Aristotle's lantern, scraping rock clean, these spiny creatures being important herbivores that prevent algae from overwhelming slow-growing corals. The brittle stars hide in coral crevices during the day, with only their thin arms extending to capture food. These relatives of sea stars being filter feeders that trap particles from water flowing past. The Christmas tree worms bore into coral, creating tubes within the limestone where they live permanently, extending colorful spiral-feeding tentacles that snap back into the tube when danger threatens, the worms spending decades in the same coral head, growing old in darkness, punctuated by brief feeding periods when tentacles emerge. The sea cucumbers plow through sand, processing sediment and extracting organic material, their feeding activities stirring and aerating the substrate while recycling nutrients. The nudibranchs, or sea slugs, crawl across reef surfaces, displaying colors that rival any coral. These shell-less mollusks, being protected by toxins acquired from their prey, many species feeding on specific sponges or corals and sequestering the chemical defenses for their own use. The mantis shrimps live in burrows, emerging to hunt with club-like or spear-like appendages that strike prey at incredible speeds. The strike creating cavitation bubbles that produce flashes of light and shockwaves that stun or kill the target. The reef's invertebrate community includes filter feeders, predators, scavengers, parasites, and species with feeding strategies so specialized they defy easy categorization, each one adapted to exploit some particular resource or microhabitat. The invertebrates being the majority of reef life, though they attract less attention than the more visible fish. The sponges that cover much of the reef surface are among the most ancient multicellular animals, their basic body plan having remained largely unchanged for over 500 million years. These filter feeders pumping vast quantities of water through their bodies to extract bacteria and organic particles. A single sponge the size of a gallon jug can filter thousands of gallons of water per day. The sponge's body being composed of channels and chambers lined with cells bearing tiny beating hairs that create water flow, the architecture being entirely dedicated to maximizing water processing capacity. The sponges come in every color imaginable and in forms ranging from thin, encrusting sheets to massive barrels large enough for a person to sit inside, each form being adapted to different water flow conditions and different feeding strategies. Some sponges harbor photosynthetic bacteria within their tissues, these symbionts contributing energy to the sponge, much as zooxanthellae do for corals, the sponge gaining both nutrition from filtered particles and from bacterial photosynthesis. The sponges produce chemical compounds that deter predators and prevent other organisms from growing on their surfaces. These chemicals being extremely diverse and complex, many having medicinal properties that researchers are investigating for human use. The sponges provide habitat for countless small creatures that live within their tissues or in spaces between sponges and the substrate, creating secondary habitat that increases the reef's structural complexity. The sponges grow slowly, adding new tissue gradually, some massive barrel sponges being hundreds of years old, these ancient organisms witnessing centuries of reef history. The sponge community is essential for reef health, processing water and cycling nutrients, removing bacteria and particles that would otherwise accumulate. The sponges being the reef's filtration system, quietly pumping water day and night, their contribution to ecosystem function being enormous. Despite their lack of mobility or apparent behavior, these simple animals performing complex functions through their elegant architecture and efficient design. The nighttime reef transforms as diurnal creatures retreat into hiding and nocturnal species emerge to feed, the shift being so dramatic that the reef seems to contain two entirely different communities occupying the same space at different times. As twilight fades, the parrotfish and wrasses that dominated daytime activity find crevices where they sleep. Many parrotfish secreting a mucus cocoon around themselves that may mask their scent from nocturnal predators, or may protect them from parasites, the cocoon taking 30 minutes to produce and being abandoned in the morning when the fish emerges. The diurnal fish hide among coral branches or wedge themselves into holes, many species changing their coloration to night patterns that provide camouflage in darkness, the reef becoming quieter as the daytime bustle subsides. The coral polyps extend their tentacles, transforming the reef's texture from smooth to fuzzy as millions of tiny arms wave in the darkness, the polyps capturing zooplankton that rises from deep water under cover of night. The octopuses emerge from dens to hunt, flowing across reef surfaces like animate liquid, their 8 arms probing crevices for crabs and sleeping fish, their ability to change color and texture, making them nearly invisible against varied backgrounds. The moray eels leave their daytime refuges to patrol the reef, their snake-like bodies undulating between coral heads, their keen sense of smell allowing them to hunt in complete darkness. The basket stars unfurl their elaborate branching arms, extending from tight daytime coils into open structures that may span several feet, these filter feeders, capturing planktonic organisms from water flowing through their arms. The cardinal fish that hid during the day emerge in schools to feed on zooplankton, their large eyes adapted for vision in low light, these small fish dominating the nighttime water column above the reef. The crabs and lobsters creep from hiding places to forage, their hard shells providing protection from the fewer predators active at night, their claws searching for food among the coral rubble. The nighttime reef pulses with different activity patterns than the daytime reef, the shift between day and night communities, allowing more species to coexist in the same space by dividing time into feeding periods, the 24-hour cycle being split into niches as surely as space is divided, the reef's temporal dimension being as important as its physical structure. The sounds produced by reef organisms create an underwater symphony that scientists are just beginning to understand and appreciate, the reef being far from silent, despite its creatures lacking the vocal cords that terrestrial animals use to produce sound. The snapping shrimp creates loud popping sounds by rapidly closing its specialized claw, the movement creating a cavitation bubble that collapses with a crack audible across considerable distances. These shrimp being so numerous on reefs that their collective snapping creates a background crackle that can be heard from boats above. The fish produce sounds through various mechanisms, including grinding their teeth, vibrating their swim bladders, or rubbing skeletal parts together. These sounds serving as communication signals for attracting mates, defending territories, or warning of danger. The parrotfish creates crunching sounds when scraping algae from coral, their beak-like teeth grinding limestone, producing sounds that contribute to the reef's acoustic environment. The coral itself produces sounds, though these are subtle. The polyps' feeding activities and the microscopic organisms living within coral tissues, creating faint biological noise. The breaking waves on the reef crest produce roaring sounds that dominate the acoustic environment in shallow areas. This wave noise, masking some biological sounds, but also creating a consistent background against which fish can detect anomalous sounds, indicating predators or prey. Researchers have discovered that reef sounds attract larval fish and invertebrates seeking settlement sites, the acoustic signature of healthy reefs serving as a homing beacon for creatures drifting in open ocean, the young organisms swimming toward reef sounds to find suitable habitat. The reef's soundscape changes throughout the day and night, different species being active at different times. The acoustic environment providing information about reef health and activity patterns. The sounds travel well through water, creating acoustic territories and communication networks that extend beyond visual range. The reef being connected through sound as well as through water flow and through the movements of its mobile residents. Sound being an invisible dimension of reef life that scientists are only beginning to map and understand. The relationship between corals and the fish that live among their branches goes beyond simple habitat provision, with some species being entirely dependent on specific coral types, and the corals sometimes benefiting from the presence of resident fish. The damselfish that defend territories on coral heads provide the coral with nutrients through their waste products. These nitrogen and phosphorus compounds being absorbed by the coral's zooxanthellae and used for growth, creating a mutualistic relationship where the fish receives shelter and the coral receives fertilizer. The coral gobies live exclusively on specific acropora corals. These tiny fish being so specialized that they cannot survive on other coral species, their entire life cycle occurring on a single coral head, where they feed on mucus produced by coral polyps. Some fish defend their host corals from corallivorous creatures like crown of thorns, sea stars, and butterfly fish, the resident fish chasing away these coral predators. Despite the attackers, often being much larger than the defenders, this protection being valuable to the coral. Though the fish's primary motivation is defending its own living space, rather than consciously protecting the coral. The fish, swimming around coral branches, create water currents that enhance oxygen delivery to coral tissues and remove metabolic wastes. This incidental benefit of fish activity, potentially improving coral health, though measuring such effects is difficult. The fish that shelter in coral during the day emerge at night to feed in surrounding areas, then return to the coral. This behavior effectively importing nutrients from beyond the reef that the fish deposit as waste near their home coral, concentrating nutrients that might otherwise be dispersed. The complexity of fish-coral relationships continues to surprise researchers as new interactions are discovered. The reef being not just a collection of species living in proximity, but rather a network of relationships where species influence each other's survival and success in countless subtle ways. The boundaries between individuals and species blurring into an integrated whole that functions as a superorganism. The reef's health, depending on maintaining these relationships, the loss of one species potentially cascading through the system as partners lose their counterparts. The crown of thorns sea star feeds exclusively on coral polyps, crawling across coral surfaces and diverting its stomach to digest coral tissue, this large spiny predator being capable of consuming several square meters of living coral per year. Under normal conditions, crown of thorns sea stars occur at low densities, and their predation on coral is balanced by coral growth, the sea stars actually providing benefits by removing fast-growing corals and creating space for slower-growing species, increasing overall reef diversity. Periodic outbreaks occur, where crown of thorns populations explode to hundreds or thousands of individuals per hectare. These population booms devastating reefs by consuming coral faster than it can regenerate. The causes of outbreaks remaining debated, though nutrient runoff from land may trigger larval survival increases. The sea star's spines contain toxins that cause painful wounds in humans and deter most predators, though the giant triton, snail, and some triggerfish prey on crown of thorns and may help control populations when these predators are abundant. The sea star moves slowly across the reef on hundreds of tube feet, its movement being almost imperceptible to casual observation. Yet it can cover considerable distances over days and weeks. The sea star population spreading across reefs like a slow tide. The relationship between crown of thorns and coral demonstrates the delicate balance in reef ecosystems. Natural predation being manageable but outbreak conditions overwhelming the reef's capacity to recover. Human activities that increase nutrient levels, potentially tipping the balance toward more frequent outbreaks. The sea star's role in reef ecology is complex, being neither purely harmful nor beneficial, but rather being a natural disturbance that historically occurred at intervals, allowing reef recovery between events, though current outbreak frequencies may exceed historical patterns, creating conditions where reefs cannot fully recover before the next wave of predation arrives. The parrotfish's role in reef health extends beyond sand production to include algae control that prevents fast-growing algae from overgrowing slow-growing corals, these colorful herbivores being essential for maintaining the balance between coral and algae. The parrotfish schools that swim across reefs graze algae like underwater cattle, their scraping keeping algal growth in check and creating patches of clean substrate where coral larvae can settle. Without sufficient parrotfish grazing, many reefs become dominated by algae that prevents coral recruitment. The parrotfish goes through remarkable color changes during its life. Juveniles and adult females typically displaying dull colors, while dominant males develop brilliant blues, greens, and pinks, some species being so different in their various life stages that they were originally classified as separate species before researchers understood their transformation. The parrotfish sleeps in a mucus cocoon that takes 30 minutes to produce each evening, the fish secreting the bubble from glands in its gills, then settling inside for the night. the cocoon possibly masking the fish's scent from nocturnal predators, or protecting against parasites. The parrotfish's pharyngeal mill, a specialized grinding structure in its throat, pulverizes the limestone it inevitably consumes while scraping algae, the ground limestone passing through the digestive system and being excreted as fine white sand that accumulates in reef lagoons. A single large parrotfish can produce several hundred pounds of sand annually. The famous white sand beaches of tropical islands being largely parrotfish excrement, this transformation of rock into sand being a continuous process that shapes reef geography. The decline of parrotfish populations through overfishing removes this essential herbivore pressure, allowing algae to proliferate and smother corals, demonstrating how removing one species can trigger cascading effects throughout the ecosystem. The parrotfish being a keystone species whose presence or absence determines reef structure and health. The coral bleaching phenomenon occurs when environmental stress causes coral polyps to expel their zooxanthellae algae, leaving the transparent polyp tissue revealing the white limestone skeleton beneath, the coral appearing bleached or ghostly pale. Temperature stress is the most common trigger for bleaching. Water temperatures just a few degrees above normal summer maximums, maintained for several weeks, being sufficient to cause widespread bleaching, though other stressors including pollution, excessive sunlight, or salinity changes can also trigger the response. The bleached coral is not dead but rather is starving, having lost its primary energy source, the polyps surviving on captured plankton alone, but this being insufficient for long-term survival. Bleached corals dying within weeks to months if conditions don't improve and allow zooxanthellae to recolonize. Some corals recover from bleaching if temperatures drop before the polyps die. New zooxanthellae colonizing from the water or from remaining algae in coral tissues, the coral regaining its color and resuming normal function, though recovered corals may show reduced growth for years after bleaching. The frequency of mass bleaching events has increased dramatically in recent decades. Many reefs now experiencing bleaching every few years rather than once per decade or less. This increased frequency, reducing the time available for recovery between events. The Great Barrier Reef experienced unprecedented back-to-back bleaching in consecutive years. This successive stress causing mortality in corals that survived the first event, but could not withstand repeated bleaching without recovery time. The bleaching response may have evolved as a mechanism allowing corals to swap their zooxanthellae for different types better adapted to changed conditions. The stress causing expulsion of poorly performing algae and creating opportunity for recolonization by better suited varieties, though this potential benefit is overwhelmed when bleaching becomes too frequent or severe. The white appearance of bleached reefs is haunting, the normally colorful coral appearing ghostly and lifeless. Entire reef sections losing color simultaneously during mass bleaching events, the transformation being visible from aerial surveys that reveal the extent of impact. These images of bleached reefs becoming symbols of climate change effects on marine ecosystems. The three main types of coral reefs form in different geological settings, each type having distinct characteristics and formation processes that occur over thousands to millions of years. Fringing reefs grow directly along coastlines, extending outward from shore in shallow water. These being the most common reef type, and typically the youngest, forming where suitable substrate exists near land and where coastal conditions allow coral growth. Barrier reefs parallel coastlines, but are separated from land by lagoons that may be several miles wide and hundreds of feet deep. These reefs forming when fringing reefs continue growing upward, while the land behind them subsides or sea level rises, creating the lagoon separation. The Great Barrier Reef is the most famous barrier reef, though similar structures exist elsewhere, all of them representing mature reef development, where growth has continued for thousands of years, while geological processes created the lagoon. Atolls are ring-shaped reefs surrounding central lagoons. These circular structures forming around volcanic islands that have subsided beneath the waves. The coral continuing to grow upward as the island slowly sinks, eventually leaving only the reef visible above water with the volcanic island far below the lagoon floor. The atoll formation process was first explained by Charles Darwin, who proposed that atolls represent the final stage of reef development on sinking volcanic islands. This theory being confirmed through deep drilling on atolls that revealed volcanic rock thousands of feet below the living reef surface. The atoll lagoons provide calm, protected waters where specialized communities develop, different from both the reef crest exposed to open ocean and from the outer reef slopes facing deep water, the atoll creating multiple distinct habitats within its ring structure. The geometry of different reef types reflects their formation history, each shape telling a story of geological processes and biological growth, the reef being both living organism and geological structure, biology and geology, combining to create these formations that blur the boundary between life and Earth. The coral skeleton reveals growth patterns similar to tree rings, the limestone being deposited in layers that reflect seasonal variations in growth rate, allowing researchers to study coral growth history and environmental conditions by analyzing skeleton structure. The coral adds high-density bands during slower winter growth and low-density bands during faster summer growth. These alternating bands being visible in cross-sections of coral cores, much like tree rings, showing annual growth cycles. Researchers extract cores from living coral by drilling carefully with hollow coring tools. These cores being cylinders of coral skeleton that can be several feet long, representing decades or centuries of growth depending on the species and the core length. The cores are analyzed using X-rays, CT scans, and other techniques that reveal the density banding patterns, researchers counting bands to determine the coral's age and measuring band thickness to assess growth rates in different years. The coral skeleton also records chemical information about past ocean conditions. The limestone incorporating trace elements and isotopes in ratios that vary with temperature, salinity, and other environmental factors. These chemical signatures being preserved in the skeleton and allowing reconstruction of past ocean conditions. The analysis of coral cores has revealed ocean temperature patterns extending back several centuries before instrumental records began, providing crucial data for understanding natural climate variability and for placing modern ocean warming in historical context. The coral acts as a natural archive, recording environmental history in its skeleton as it grows, each layer being a time capsule, preserving information about the year it formed, the coral being simultaneously living organism and historical record, present and past combined in its structure. The deep sea contains coral reefs that differ dramatically from their shallow water tropical relatives. These cold water corals growing in darkness at depths where sunlight never penetrates, thriving without zooxanthellae, and surviving entirely on captured food. The cold water corals grow much more slowly than tropical corals, adding only fractions of an inch per year. Some colonies being thousands of years old, these ancient organisms, witnessing centuries of ocean history from their deep water habitats. The deep reefs form on underwater mountains, canyon walls, and continental margins, where currents are strong enough to deliver consistent food supply, the corals needing flow to bring zooplankton and organic particles within reach of their tentacles. The deep coral species include different groups than tropical reef builders, many being solitary cup corals or sea fans rather than colonial stony corals, though some deep species do form massive colonial structures that create true reefs comparable to tropical formations. The deep reefs provide habitat for unique communities of fish and invertebrates, adapted to cold, dark conditions, these species being different from tropical reef inhabitants and often being poorly known due to the difficulty of studying deep-sea environments. The cold water coral reefs face threats from deep-sea fishing, particularly bottom trawling that drags heavy nets across the seafloor, destroying coral structures that took thousands of years to grow, this damage being largely irreversible within human timescales given the extremely slow growth rates. The discovery that reefs exist in deep cold waters was relatively recent, these ecosystems being unknown to science until development of deep-sea exploration technology, revealing that reef formation is not limited to shallow tropical waters. but rather represents a more universal biological process, occurring wherever conditions allow coral growth. The deep reefs, expanding our understanding of what reefs are and where they can exist. The relationship between ocean chemistry and coral health involves complex interactions between carbon dioxide, calcium carbonate, and seawater pH, these chemical factors determining whether corals can efficiently build their limestone skeletons. The ocean absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, this gas dissolving in seawater and forming carbonic acid, which lowers the ocean's pH in a process called ocean acidification. This chemical change being a direct consequence of rising atmospheric carbon dioxide levels from fossil fuel burning. As ocean pH decreases, the availability of carbonate ions that corals need for skeleton building also decreases, making the calcification process require more energy, corals in more acidic water growing more slowly and producing weaker skeletons, more susceptible to erosion. The ocean's average pH has already decreased measurably since pre-industrial times, shifting from slightly more basic toward neutral. This change, seeming small, but representing significant alteration in ocean chemistry with implications for all calcifying organisms. Projections suggest continued acidification as atmospheric carbon dioxide rises, ocean pH potentially decreasing enough to prevent coral skeleton formation entirely in some regions, though the timeline and severity of impacts remain uncertain and depend on future emission trajectories. Some coral species and some individual corals show greater tolerance for acidification than others. This variation, suggesting that adaptation may be possible, though the rate of chemical change may exceed corals' evolutionary capacity to adapt. The calcification process becomes thermodynamically unfavorable when seawater becomes corrosive to calcium carbonate. This threshold potentially being reached in some ocean regions within decades, threatening not just coral growth, but also maintenance of existing reef structures that may begin dissolving faster than corals can repair them. The ocean acidification threat operates on a different timescale than temperature stress, acidification being a gradual change that may take decades to severely impact reefs, but being potentially irreversible without active intervention to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This chemical threat representing a fundamental challenge to coral survival that may prove even more difficult to address than warming waters. The mesophotic coral ecosystems exist at depths between 100 and 500 feet. These twilight zone reefs, receiving barely enough sunlight for zooxanthellae photosynthesis, creating conditions where coral growth is possible but marginal. The mesophotic reefs contain different coral species than shallow reefs, many being specialized for low-light conditions with adaptations including increased zooxanthellae density, different pigments that capture available light more efficiently, or plate-like growth forms that maximize surface area for light capture. These deeper reefs were largely unknown until technical diving and submersibles allowed exploration, revealing that coral reefs extend much deeper than previously recognized. The mesophotic zone, containing significant reef area and biomass that had been overlooked. Some researchers suggested that mesophotic reefs might serve as refuges from surface warming or storm damage, potentially reseeding shallow reefs after disturbances, though subsequent research has shown that mesophotic corals face their own threats and that many species differ between depths, limiting the refuge potential. The mesophotic fish communities include species found nowhere else. These specialized inhabitants adapted to the dim blue light filtering down from above, their visual systems tuned to wavelengths that penetrate to depth. The exploration of mesophotic reefs continues to reveal new species and previously unknown ecosystem processes, demonstrating that coral reef biodiversity extends across greater depth ranges than the shallow snorkeling depths where most reef research occurs. The full extent of reef life requiring technical diving or robotic exploration to document. The transition from shallow to mesophotic to deep aphotic zones represents a continuum of decreasing light and changing coral communities. The reef being not just a shallow surface phenomenon but rather extending downward wherever conditions permit. The vertical dimension of reefs, being as important as their horizontal extent for understanding their total area and ecological significance. The symbiotic relationships on coral reefs extend far beyond the coral-zooxanthellae partnership to include countless other mutualisms, commensalisms, and parasitisms that connect reef organisms in complex webs of interaction. The clownfish lives among sea anemone tentacles, protected from the anemone's stinging cells by mucus coating that prevents triggering of the stings, the fish gaining protection from predators. While the anemone may benefit from the fish chasing away butterfly fish that prey on anemones, the cleaner shrimp establishes stations where fish come to have parasites removed, the shrimp receiving food while the fish gains health benefits, this relationship being so reliable that fish line up waiting their turn at popular cleaning stations, the cleaner shrimp being recognized and protected by predatory fish that could easily consume them. The pistol shrimp and goby fish share burrows, the nearly blind shrimp digging and maintaining the burrow while the sharp-eyed goby acts as lookout, the shrimp keeping one antenna touching the goby at all times to receive warning taps when danger approaches. This partnership, allowing both species to occupy sandy habitats where neither could survive alone. The hermit crabs that carry sea anemones on their shells gain protection from predators deterred by anemone stings, while the anemone gains mobility and access to food scraps from the crab's meals, some species having such specific partnerships that the crab carefully transplants its anemones when changing shells. The relationships span the spectrum from loose associations to obligate partnerships where neither partner can survive without the other, these connections being so numerous that drawing complete webs of reef relationships would create diagrams of overwhelming complexity. Every species being connected to multiple others through various types of interactions, the reef being not a collection of independent species but rather an integrated community where the survival of each depends on many others, the whole being far more than the sum of its parts. The nutrient cycling in coral reef ecosystems operates with remarkable efficiency, despite the surrounding ocean being essentially an aquatic desert with very low nutrient concentrations, the reef retaining and recycling nutrients, rather than allowing them to be carried away by currents. The tight nutrient cycling begins with nitrogen fixation by cyanobacteria. Living on reef surfaces and within coral tissues, these bacteria, converting atmospheric nitrogen, dissolved in seawater into forms that other organisms can use, providing new nitrogen input to the system. The coral mucus that polyps secrete constantly serves multiple functions, including capturing food particles, protecting tissues, and providing energy-rich food for other organisms, the mucus being consumed by fish and invertebrates, effectively transferring energy from coral to other reef residents. The waste products from fish and other animals are quickly taken up by algae and coral zooxanthellae, these nutrients being incorporated into living tissue rather than being lost to surrounding waters, the biological uptake being so efficient that water flowing away from reefs contains lower nutrient levels than water flowing onto reefs. The decomposers, including bacteria, fungi, and small invertebrates, break down dead organic matter, releasing nutrients back into forms that primary producers can use, completing cycles that might take only hours or days rather than being dispersed across the ocean. The reef's high productivity in nutrient-poor water results from this efficient recycling, the system functioning like a space station where nothing is wasted and everything is reused, the biological community maintaining high biomass and productivity through conservation and retention rather than through high resource input. The nutrient cycling demonstrates the reef's maturity as an ecosystem, the efficiency indicating long evolutionary refinement of interactions that minimize waste and maximize retention, the reef being able to thrive in nutrient-poor conditions, precisely because it has evolved mechanisms to hoard and recycle the nutrients it captures. The resilience of coral reefs refers to their capacity to recover from disturbances, absorb change, and maintain their essential structure and function, despite being impacted by storms, bleaching, or other stresses. Resilient reefs typically have high coral diversity, the presence of many species, ensuring that some survive whatever disturbance occurs and can recolonize affected areas. Diversity, acting as insurance against catastrophic loss. The herbivore populations, particularly parrotfish and sea urchins, contribute to resilience by controlling algae that might otherwise overgrow coral, maintaining the algae-coral balance that allows coral recruitment after disturbances. The reef's structural complexity itself contributes to resilience by providing refuges where coral fragments can survive, even when exposed surfaces are damaged. These protected microhabitats, serving as sources for recovery when conditions improve. The connection between reefs through larval dispersal enhances resilience at larger scales. Larvae from undisturbed reefs, reseeding disturbed areas, and allowing recovery even when local reproduction is insufficient. The network of reefs, functioning as a connected population rather than as isolated units. The resilience is not unlimited. Repeated disturbances that occur faster than recovery time can shift reefs to alternate states dominated by algae or other organisms rather than coral, these phase shifts being potentially irreversible without active intervention to reduce grazing pressure or remove algae. The management actions that support resilience include protecting herbivore populations through fishing regulations, reducing local stressors like pollution and sedimentation, maintaining water quality, and protecting large connected areas of reef habitat rather than small isolated patches, these actions giving reefs their best chance of surviving global stressors like climate change that cannot be addressed through local management alone. The concept of resilience provides framework for understanding reef dynamics and for prioritizing conservation actions, the goal being not to prevent all change, but rather to maintain the reef's capacity to recover and persist through changing conditions, to bend without breaking, to absorb shocks while maintaining fundamental character. The resilient reef being one that can survive into an uncertain future. The fossil coral reefs, preserved in ancient rocks, reveal that reef formation has occurred intermittently throughout Earth history, with reef-building organisms changing, but the ecological process of reef construction persisting across hundreds of millions of years. The earliest reefs formed over 2 billion years ago from cyanobacteria and other microbes. Though these structures differ from modern coral reefs, they demonstrate that biological reef construction is ancient. The first coral reefs appeared in the Ordovician period around 470 million years ago, though these early corals differed from modern reef builders and became extinct in subsequent mass extinctions. Different organisms dominated reef building at different times in Earth history, including various coral groups, algae, sponges, and even mollusks, the specific reef builders changing, but the ecological function of reef formation persisting. The coral reefs we see today represent the latest iteration of reef building, the modern coral groups having evolved their current forms over the past 50 million years, though their ancestors extend much farther back in time. The fossil reefs provide evidence of how reef ecosystems responded to past climate changes and mass extinctions, revealing that reef collapse has occurred multiple times in Earth history, typically requiring millions of years for reef ecosystems to recover. This geological perspective, suggesting that the current crisis facing reefs represents a potentially long-lasting shift in ocean ecosystems. The fossil record shows that while individual reef-building species and groups went extinct, the ecological process of reef formation persisted, new organisms eventually evolving to fill the reef-building role, though the timescales for such evolution and recovery far exceed human concerns. The ancient reefs remind us that coral reefs as we know them are temporary on geological timescales, the specific corals that build modern reefs being relatively recent products of evolution, though the broader pattern of reef construction being ancient and likely to persist in some form as long as oceans exist, even if the current incarnation of coral reefs does not survive the changes humans are imposing on ocean conditions. The coral spawning synchrony that occurs on reefs represents one of nature's great spectacles. Though few humans witness it, millions of coral polyps, releasing eggs and sperm, simultaneously turning the water milky with reproductive material. The cues that trigger spawning include water temperature, lunar cycle, time of day, and possibly other factors, these signals being integrated by the coral to time release for maximum fertilization success. The spawning typically occurs in evening hours after sunset, the darkness providing protection from visual predators that might consume the eggs. Though many fish and invertebrates still feed heavily during spawning, the sheer abundance of gametes, overwhelming predators, and ensuring some survive, the eggs and sperm drift upward toward the surface where fertilization occurs, the developing embryos spending hours to days in the plankton before becoming swimming larvae, this pelagic phase, allowing dispersal away from parent colonies. The spawning may be timed to coincide with neap tides when current speeds are lower, reducing the rate at which gametes are dispersed and increasing the probability of egg-sperm encounters, the correlation between spawning and tidal cycle being strong in some regions. The mass spawning means that individual polyps sacrifice the ability to choose their mate, the gametes mixing randomly in the water, though this strategy works because of the genetic diversity created when gametes from many colonies mix, preventing inbreeding that would occur if individual colonies self-fertilized. The visual spectacle of spawning attracts divers and researchers who monitor reefs during predicted spawning periods, documenting the event and sometimes collecting eggs for coral restoration programs. The predictability of spawning, allowing scientific study of what would otherwise be impossible to observe. The spawning represents the reef's renewal, the next generation being launched into the currents. Most larvae dying, but some finding suitable settlement sites and establishing new colonies. The ancient cycle continuing, life producing more life. The reef regenerating itself through the simple imperative to reproduce, the spawning being both an ending and a beginning. The microbes that live on and within coral reefs represent an entire invisible ecosystem, these bacteria, archaea, and viruses being critical for reef function, though they remain largely unstudied compared to the visible organisms. The coral mucus layer hosts diverse bacterial communities that may protect coral from pathogens, assist with nutrient cycling, or produce compounds that affect coral health, these microbial partners being so important that some researchers consider them part of the coral organism. The coral being not just animal and algae, but rather animal, algae, and bacteria functioning as a superorganism. The nitrogen fixation that supports reef productivity occurs primarily through bacterial action, these microbes converting atmospheric nitrogen into biologically available forms, the bacteria living as free-living organisms on reef surfaces or within the tissues of sponges, corals, and other hosts. The viruses are incredibly abundant on reefs. The seawater above reefs containing millions of viral particles per milliliter. These viruses infecting bacteria and other microbes, killing them and releasing their cellular contents back into the water. This viral shunt recycling nutrients that would otherwise be locked in bacterial biomass. The microbes decompose organic matter on the reef, breaking down dead tissue, waste products, and coral mucus, releasing nutrients and completing the recycling loops that maintain reef productivity. The microbial communities change in response to coral stress. The bacterial composition in corals showing shifts before visible signs of disease or bleaching appear, suggesting that microbial monitoring might provide early warning of coral health problems. The study of reef microbes has accelerated with genetic sequencing technology that allows identification of microbes without needing to culture them, revealing diversity that far exceeds previous estimates, and discovering that most reef microbes have never been formally described or studied. The microbial dimension of reefs reminds us that the visible organisms are supported by vast, invisible communities. The colorful fish and coral being merely the visible manifestation of ecosystems that extend down to the microscopic scale, the reef being alive at all scales from viruses to whales, each scale being essential for the whole. The role of herbivory in maintaining reef health cannot be overstated. The consumption of algae by fish and invertebrates preventing algal overgrowth that would smother slow-growing corals. The balance between herbivores and algae, determining whether reefs remain coral-dominated or shift to algal dominance. The reduction of herbivore populations through fishing or disease can trigger phase shifts where algae proliferates, covering the reef and preventing coral recruitment. These altered reefs, being less structurally complex and supporting lower fish diversity. The Caribbean provides a dramatic example of herbivore loss effects. The mass die-off of the long-spined sea urchin in the 1980s, combined with overfishing of parrotfish, causing many Caribbean reefs to shift from coral to algal dominance, these reefs remaining degraded decades later, despite reduced fishing pressure, demonstrating that phase shifts can be difficult or impossible to reverse. The herbivore community includes many species with different feeding modes, some scraping algal turfs, others browsing fleshy macroalgae, still others consuming detritus. The diversity of herbivores being important because different species control different algal types. The protection of herbivore populations through marine reserves and fishing regulations is among the most effective management actions for supporting reef health, ensuring that algae remain in check and that coral can recruit successfully. The herbivores benefit from the algae they consume, but also depend on the reef structure for shelter, creating positive feedback, where healthy reefs support diverse herbivore populations that maintain conditions, allowing coral dominance, while degraded reefs lose structural complexity, support fewer herbivores, and become increasingly algae-dominated. The herbivore-algae-coral relationship illustrates the interconnected nature of reef ecology, where populations of species that don't directly interact are nonetheless linked through indirect effects. The removal of herbivores affecting coral not through direct impacts, but through releasing algae from grazing pressure. These indirect effects being common on reefs and making prediction of management outcomes challenging, each intervention potentially triggering cascades of effects through the ecosystem. The coral diseases that affect reef-building corals have increased in frequency and severity in recent decades. These infections causing tissue loss, reduced growth, and mortality in affected colonies. The diseases being caused by various pathogens, including bacteria, fungi, and viruses. White band disease affects Caribbean elkhorn and staghorn corals, causing tissue to slough off in bands that progress along branches, leaving bare white skeleton behind. This disease having contributed to massive declines in these fast-growing branching species that once dominated shallow Caribbean reefs. Black band disease appears as dark bands of cyanobacteria and other microbes that move across coral surfaces, killing tissue as they advance, the black band being visible from distance and progressing slowly enough that researchers can track individual infections over weeks. The stony coral tissue loss disease discovered in Florida has spread throughout the Caribbean, affecting dozens of coral species and causing rapid tissue loss, some colonies losing all living tissue within weeks of first showing symptoms. This disease being particularly concerning because of its wide host range and rapid progression. The causes of increased disease prevalence remain debated, with climate change, pollution, and other stressors potentially weakening coral immune systems or creating conditions favoring pathogen growth, the warming waters particularly being implicated in disease outbreaks. The diseases spread between colonies through water movement and potentially through contact with diseased tissue. The interconnected nature of reefs, allowing pathogens to move through populations, some diseases spreading in wave-like patterns that can be tracked across regions. The treatment options for coral diseases are limited. Some managers applying antibiotics to valuable colonies, but treating diseases across entire reefs being impractical, the management focus being more on reducing stressors that may increase disease susceptibility rather than on treating individual infections. The disease impacts vary by species, some corals being highly susceptible while others show resistance. This variation suggesting that evolution may favor disease-resistant genotypes, though whether such evolution can occur fast enough to keep pace with increasing disease pressure remains uncertain, the diseases being yet another stressor compounding the multiple challenges facing coral reefs in the modern ocean. The restoration efforts aimed at rebuilding coral populations employ various techniques, including coral gardening, where fragments are grown in underwater nurseries and then transplanted to degraded reefs. This approach being used worldwide to increase coral cover and diversity. The coral gardening process begins with collecting small fragments from healthy donor colonies. These fragments being attached to structures like ropes, racks, or frames where they grow for months to years before being large enough for outplanting. The nursery-grown corals grow faster than they would on the reef because they are positioned to optimize light and flow, suspended in water columns where they don't compete with algae or encounter predators and diseases as frequently as reef-attached corals. When fragments reach adequate size, typically hand-sized or larger, they are transplanted onto reef substrate, being attached with epoxy or marine cement. The outplanted corals, ideally establishing and growing into colonies that reproduce and contribute to reef recovery. The restoration programs have successfully increased coral cover in some locations, creating restored patches that support fish and invertebrate communities resembling natural reefs, though the scale of restoration remains tiny compared to the scale of reef degradation globally. The genetic diversity of restored corals receives increasing attention. Managers recognizing that planting genetically identical fragments creates uniform populations vulnerable to disease or stress. Efforts now focusing on maintaining diverse genetic stock in nurseries to produce resilient, restored populations. The coral restoration techniques continue evolving. Recent innovations, including the use of microfragmentation, where corals are broken into very small pieces that grow rapidly when properly tended, and the development of methods for growing corals from collected spawn, allowing creation of genetically diverse restoration stock. The restoration represents hope and action. People working to repair damage and to give reefs a chance at survival, though restoration alone cannot save reefs if the underlying stressors, including climate change and pollution, continue. The restored corals facing the same threats that degraded the reefs initially, restoration being valuable but needing to be paired with broader environmental protection to achieve lasting success. The economic value of coral reefs extends far beyond their obvious beauty. These ecosystems providing services worth billions of dollars annually through fisheries, tourism, coastal protection, and other benefits that support human communities. The fisheries associated with coral reefs provide protein and income for millions of people in tropical countries. The reef's productivity supporting fish populations that feed coastal communities and supply commercial fisheries, though overfishing threatens this resource. The tourism generated by coral reefs brings economic benefits to many tropical nations. Visitors coming to snorkel, dive, and observe reef life. This tourism creating jobs and revenue that support local economies, while also creating incentives to protect reefs. The coastal protection provided by reefs saves billions in avoided storm damage. The reef structure breaking waves and reducing their energy before they reach shore, protecting coastal communities and infrastructure from erosion and flooding. This service becoming more valuable as sea level rises and storm intensity potentially increases. The reefs also provide materials including sand for beaches and limestone for construction, though these extractive uses can damage reefs and are increasingly being restricted in favor of non-consumptive uses. The pharmaceutical compounds derived from reef organisms represent potential future value, with researchers investigating marine natural products for medical applications. Several drugs already in use, having been derived from reef organisms, suggesting that undiscovered compounds may hold solutions to human health challenges. The economic valuation studies attempt to quantify reef value in monetary terms. These calculations showing that healthy reefs provide more economic benefit than degraded ones, though such valuations struggle to capture the full worth of these ecosystems, some values being difficult to monetize, including aesthetic, cultural, and existence values that people place on reefs, regardless of direct use. The economic arguments for reef conservation complement the ethical and ecological arguments, showing that protecting reefs makes financial sense, the return on investment in reef conservation being high when calculated over appropriate timescales, though short-term economic pressures often override long-term considerations, leading to decisions that sacrifice reef health for immediate gains. The coral reef's three-dimensional structure creates the physical complexity that allows thousands of species to coexist. The branching, plate-like, and massive coral growth forms, creating surfaces, crevices, caves, and overhangs that serve as habitat for the reef's diverse residents. The structural complexity provides shelter from predators, creating hiding places where small fish and invertebrates can escape from larger predators. This physical protection, reducing mortality and allowing prey populations to persist despite predation pressure. The complex surfaces provide substrate for sessile organisms, including sponges, tunicates, and algae. These organisms competing for space and creating additional structure and habitat. The reef being built through accumulation of many generations of organisms, all contributing to the architectural complexity. The holes and crevices in reef structure serve as breeding sites and nursery habitat for many species, the protected spaces allowing eggs and larvae to develop with reduced exposure to predators and currents. The complexity influences water flow patterns, creating areas of high flow that deliver food and oxygen, while also creating calm spots where sediment settles. This flow variation, creating microhabitats with different conditions, supporting different species. As reefs degrade and coral dies, the structure erodes through physical and biological processes, the limestone being broken down by boring organisms, dissolved by slightly acidic seawater, and smashed by waves, the reef gradually flattening and losing complexity. The loss of structure represents a second phase of degradation following coral death, the habitat value declining even more as the physical architecture disappears, this structural loss being slower than initial coral mortality, but being equally important for determining whether reefs can recover. The maintenance of structure depends on ongoing coral growth that adds new limestone faster than erosion removes it, the balance between construction and destruction, determining whether reefs persist as complex three-dimensional habitats or gradually dissolve into rubble fields that support far less life, the structure being as important as the living coral for determining the reef's ecological value and its capacity to support diverse communities. The adaptations that allow organisms to thrive on coral reefs include specializations in diet, behavior, morphology, and physiology, these adaptations being so specific that many reef species cannot survive elsewhere, their entire biology being tuned to reef conditions. The elongated snouts of butterfly fish allow them to reach into coral crevices and extract small invertebrates inaccessible to other predators. This morphological specialization, allowing exploitation of food resources unavailable to competitors. The cleaning symbioses represent behavioral adaptations, with cleaner species developing signals and behaviors that advertise their services, while clients develop the capacity to recognize cleaners and to inhibit predatory responses while being cleaned. The camouflage abilities of many reef fish involve not just coloration but also behavioral components, fish positioning themselves to maximize camouflage effectiveness, and sometimes adjusting their color patterns to match current backgrounds. The toxins produced by many reef organisms represent chemical adaptations, these defensive compounds deterring predators and allowing otherwise vulnerable species to survive, the bright coloration of toxic species advertising their unpalatability to potential predators. The physiological adaptations to reef life include the coral's association with zooanthelle, the parrotfish's pharyngeal mill for grinding limestone, the sponge's efficient filtration system, and countless other specializations that allow species to exploit particular resources or habitats. The adaptations demonstrate evolution's creative power, the reef environment presenting challenges and opportunities that have been met through diverse solutions, each species solving the problem of survival in its own way. the accumulated adaptations across the reef community, representing millions of years of evolutionary refinement. The specialized nature of reef organisms makes them vulnerable to environmental changes, their adaptations being precisely tuned to conditions that have been relatively stable for thousands of years. Rapid changes, potentially moving conditions outside the range to which organisms are adapted. The specialists that thrive in stable conditions, often being less resilient than generalists when conditions change, the reef's diversity being both its strength and potentially its vulnerability as the ocean changes around it. The larval dispersal patterns that connect reef populations determine whether reefs function as isolated populations or as interconnected networks, the larvae drifting on currents, potentially traveling hundreds of miles before settling or dying in the open ocean. The larval duration varies by species, some larvae being competent to settle within days, while others remain in the plankton for weeks or months. The longer planktonic periods, allowing greater dispersal distances, but also increasing mortality, as larvae are consumed by predators or swept into unsuitable habitat. The ocean currents carry larvae along predictable pathways, these current patterns creating connectivity between reefs, where downstream reefs receive larvae from upstream sources. This connectivity being critical for maintaining populations, because local recruitment is often insufficient to replace mortality. The larvae must survive the journey while remaining capable of settlement. These tiny organisms facing challenges, including predation, starvation, and being swept into water too deep or too cold for survival, the vast majority of larvae dying before finding suitable settlement sites. The larvae have some capacity to influence their fate, despite being at the mercy of currents. Many species swimming actively during their larval phase and showing preferences for certain settlement cues, including reef sounds, chemical signals from reef organisms, and appropriate substrate types. The connectivity patterns mean that protecting one reef provides benefits to distant reefs that receive larvae from the protected source, while degradation of upstream reefs reduces recruitment at downstream sites, these interactions requiring regional rather than local management approaches. The study of larval connectivity uses techniques including genetic analysis of recruits to identify their source populations, chemical analysis of larval otoliths that record water properties experienced during larval life, and sophisticated computer modeling, combining current patterns with larval behavior to predict dispersal paths. The connectivity networks are complex and often surprising, with some reefs being major exporters of larvae, while others are primarily importers, some populations being relatively self-seeding, while others depending entirely on distant sources. Understanding these patterns being essential for designing effective networks of protected areas that maintain connectivity and support reef persistence across regions, rather than protecting isolated fragments that cannot sustain populations long-term. The crown jewel species of coral reefs attract disproportionate attention and conservation concern. These charismatic organisms, including sea turtles, sharks, rays, and groupers, serving as ambassadors for reef conservation despite being only a tiny fraction of reef biodiversity. The sea turtles that nest on beaches and feed on reef, seagrass and sponges represent connections between reef, beach, and open ocean ecosystems. These ancient reptiles, having survived for millions of years, but now facing numerous threats from humans. The reef sharks, including blacktip, whitetip, and gray reef sharks, patrol reef edges and channels, these predators helping maintain ecological balance by consuming weak or unwary fish, though shark populations have declined dramatically through fishing pressure. The manta rays that visit reefs to be cleaned by wrasse and other cleaner fish represent connections between reefs and open ocean. These gentle giants filtering plankton and serving as attractions for dive tourism, their intelligence and curious nature creating memorable encounters with human observers. The large groupers, like Nassau grouper and Goliath grouper, that once dominated reef fish communities, have declined through overfishing, these apex predators being slow-growing and long-lived, making them vulnerable to fishing pressure and slow to recover when protected. The focus on charismatic species sometimes overshadows the less visible organisms that form the reef's foundation, though the flagship species serve valuable roles in generating public interest and funding that benefits entire ecosystems. The conservation of charismatic species requires protecting their reef habitats, creating alignment between the goals of species-focused and ecosystem-focused conservation. The protection of sea turtle feeding grounds, or shark populations, necessarily protecting the reefs they depend on. The emotional connection people feel toward turtles, dolphins, and other charismatic creatures can be leveraged to support broader conservation goals, though care must be taken to ensure that protecting a few popular species doesn't come at the expense of less charismatic but equally important organisms, the ideal being conservation approaches that protect entire ecosystems and all their inhabitants, rather than focusing narrowly on a few species. The traditional ecological knowledge held by indigenous and local communities who have lived alongside coral reefs for generations contains valuable information about reef ecology, sustainable use practices, and historical conditions. This knowledge, complementing scientific understanding and informing modern conservation efforts. The traditional management systems in many Pacific Island cultures include seasonal closures of fishing areas, size limits on harvested species, and gear restrictions that maintain fish populations while allowing sustainable harvest. These practices, demonstrating understanding of population dynamics and sustainable yield principles. The oral histories and traditional stories contain information about past reef conditions, species abundance, and environmental changes. This historical knowledge, extending back beyond written records and providing context for understanding current conditions and rates of change. The traditional practices often include spiritual or cultural components that promote conservation, with certain species or areas being protected through taboos or customs that limit exploitation. These cultural practices, maintaining biodiversity, even when the stated purpose is spiritual rather than explicitly conservational. The integration of traditional knowledge with scientific research creates more complete understanding than either approach alone could provide. The local knowledge of specific places and species, complementing the general principles and quantitative methods of science. The recognition of traditional knowledge also addresses issues of equity and justice, acknowledging that indigenous and local communities have been managing reefs successfully for generations, and that conservation efforts should build on existing practices rather than imposing external approaches that ignore local knowledge and priorities. The challenge lies in respecting traditional knowledge, while also recognizing that current conditions may require new approaches, the traditional systems having been developed for human populations and environmental conditions that differed from the present. Adaptation being necessary while maintaining the wisdom embedded in traditional practices. The partnerships between indigenous communities, local stakeholders, and scientists represent the most promising path forward for reef conservation, combining different types of knowledge and sharing decision-making authority. The conservation being more effective and more equitable when it incorporates diverse perspectives and respects the rights and knowledge of the communities who depend most directly on reef health. The sensory environment of coral reefs includes not just visual stimuli but also acoustic, chemical, and tactile information that organisms use to navigate, communicate, find food, and avoid predators. This multisensory landscape being rich beyond human perception. The chemical signals dissolved in seawater provide information about food sources, mates, competitors, and predators. Many organisms detecting chemical concentrations at parts per trillion, their olfactory sensitivity, allowing them to follow scent trails to their sources. The lateral line system of fish detects water movements and pressure changes, allowing detection of nearby predators or prey, even in darkness or murky water. This mechanosensory system being critical for avoiding collisions and for detecting danger. The electrical fields generated by muscle contractions can be detected by some fish, particularly sharks and rays, with specialized electroreceptors, allowing them to locate hidden prey, even when buried in sand with no visual or chemical cues. The tactile environment includes water flow patterns that organisms use for orientation, current speeds that determine where sessile species can establish, and substrate textures that influence settlement decisions for larvae choosing where to begin their adult lives. The integration of information from multiple sensory channels allows reef organisms to perceive their environment more completely than any single sense would permit. The combination of visual, chemical, acoustic, and other signals creating rich perceptual worlds that differ dramatically from human sensory experience. The anthropocentric bias in reef research has historically emphasized visual aspects because humans are visual animals, but increasing recognition of other sensory modalities reveals that we have been missing entire dimensions of reef ecology. The sounds, smells, and flows being as important as sights for many reef residents, understanding the full sensory environment being necessary for comprehending how organisms experience the reef and make decisions about habitat use, feeding, reproduction, and survival. The calcification crisis facing coral reefs involves the challenges corals face in building their skeletons as ocean chemistry changes, this process being fundamental to reef formation, yet being threatened by acidification and other factors. The energy required for calcification increases as seawater becomes more acidic. The chemical gradients that corals must work against becoming steeper, forcing corals to allocate more energy to skeleton building and leaving less for growth, reproduction, and stress response. Some coral species show remarkable ability to maintain calcification, even in acidified conditions. These tolerant species potentially being the survivors if ocean chemistry continues changing, though whether they can maintain reef structure alone remains uncertain. The coral's ability to create an environment within its tissues that differs from surrounding seawater allows some chemical control over calcification. The coral actively pumping ions to create conditions favorable for skeleton formation, though this biological control requires energy and has limits. The nighttime dissolution of coral skeleton occurs when polyps are active and their respiration produces carbon dioxide, this nightly erosion being balanced by daytime calcification, but the balance shifting as background ocean chemistry changes. The calcification rates measured on contemporary reefs are already declining in many locations, this change being subtle but significant. The reefs still growing but more slowly than historical rates. The reduced calcification, meaning that reefs may not keep pace with sea level rise or may become more vulnerable to erosion. The tipping points in calcification remain uncertain. Scientists debating at what pH or carbonate saturation level corals will be unable to build skeletons faster than erosion removes them, this threshold potentially being reached within decades in some ocean regions. The calcification challenge represents a fundamental threat to coral reef persistence, potentially more severe than warming, because it directly attacks the process that creates reef structure. The corals might survive, but without building the limestone frameworks that define reefs. The future potentially holding coral communities living on rock substrates but unable to construct new reefs. The end of reef building representing transformation of marine ecosystems that has no precedent in human history. The seasonal patterns on coral reefs create temporal structure that organisms synchronize their activities with. The seasons in tropical regions being subtle compared to temperate zones, but still influencing reef ecology through variations in temperature, rainfall, and productivity. The summer months bring warmer water and sometimes increased rainfall that reduces salinity near shore. These conditions affecting coral physiology and sometimes triggering spawning or bleaching depending on temperature extremes. The winter cooling provides relief from summer heat stress, allowing corals to recover condition after summer's challenges, though severe winter cooling can itself stress tropical organisms adapted to warm, stable temperatures. The seasonal wind patterns influence upwelling that brings nutrients and cooler water from depth. These upwelling seasons increasing productivity and sometimes reducing temperatures enough to provide thermal relief during otherwise stressful periods. The fish recruitment pulses show seasonal patterns, with certain species spawning during particular months, their larvae settling weeks later in predictable timing that creates seasonal variation in juvenile abundance. The coral spawning events synchronize with seasons, occurring primarily during summer months, when temperature and lunar cycle align, the precise timing varying by location, but being consistent at each reef across years. The seasonal patterns create predictability that organisms exploit through timing, their reproduction, migration, and other behaviors to coincide with favorable conditions. The seasons being subtle but significant, tropical reefs being less seasonal than temperate ecosystems but far from constant. The organisms tracking seasonal cues and responding to them in ways that optimize survival and reproduction. The climate change potentially disrupts seasonal patterns through altering temperature ranges, changing rainfall patterns, and affecting ocean circulation. These changes in seasonal predictability potentially affecting organisms that depend on seasonal cues for timing, critical life events. The disruption of seasons being another way that climate change affects reef organisms beyond simple warming. The future scenarios for coral reefs range from optimistic visions where aggressive climate action and effective local management allow reef persistence to pessimistic projections where continued warming and acidification cause catastrophic collapse. The actual outcome depending on decisions made in coming years. The optimistic scenarios require rapid reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that limits warming to levels that corals can potentially adapt to, combined with strong local management that reduces other stresses and maintains herbivore populations, these conditions being achievable, but requiring unprecedented international cooperation and willingness to make difficult choices. The moderate scenarios involve continued climate change, causing substantial coral mortality and reef degradation, but some reefs surviving in refuges where conditions remain favorable, these remnant reefs potentially serving as sources for recolonization if conditions later improve. Though the geographic range of reef ecosystems would contract substantially, the pessimistic scenarios project that continued high emissions cause warming and acidification that exceed coral tolerance limits globally, leading to widespread mortality and phase shifts to algal or other alternative states. The reef structures gradually eroding without living coral to maintain them. This transformation, occurring within decades and being essentially irreversible on human timescales. The uncertainty in projections arises from multiple sources, including uncertainty about future emissions, about climate sensitivity, about coral adaptation potential, and about interactions between multiple stressors, the complex system behavior, making precise predictions impossible, though general trajectories being clear. The window for action is narrow. Decisions made in the next decade, determining whether coral reefs persist through the 21st century, or whether we witness their functional extinction, the stakes being enormous, not just for reefs, but for the millions of people who depend on them for food, income, and coastal protection. The future of reefs ultimately depends on human choices about energy systems, land use, fishing practices, and pollution control. The reefs being passive recipients of human impacts, their fate being determined in boardrooms and voting booths, far from tropical waters, the responsibility for reef conservation lying squarely with humanity, the question being whether we value these ancient ecosystems enough to make the changes necessary to ensure their survival. The coral reef as an ecosystem represents one of nature's great achievements, millions of years of evolution, creating interactions and dependencies that result in remarkable productivity, diversity, and beauty. These attributes making reefs both scientifically fascinating and aesthetically compelling. The reef demonstrates how simple organisms can create complex structures through repetition and time, each polyp being simple, but their collective efforts building formations that rival terrestrial mountains in scale and complexity. The reef shows how cooperation between different organisms can create emergent properties. The coral-algae partnership being the foundation, but countless other mutualisms contributing to overall ecosystem function. The reef illustrates how diversity creates stability. The multitude of species, providing functional redundancy that allows the ecosystem to maintain essential processes even when individual species are lost. The reef exemplifies nutrient efficiency, the tight recycling loops, maintaining productivity despite negligible external inputs, the system being closed and conservative in its nutrient management. The reef reveals how structure creates opportunity, the physical complexity generating habitat diversity that allows countless species to coexist in limited space, the architecture being as important as the energy flow for determining diversity. The reef demonstrates the importance of indirect effects, species influencing others, not through direct interaction, but through chains of effects that propagate through the food web, making prediction and management challenging. The reef embodies resilience and fragility simultaneously, the system persisting through millions of years while also being vulnerable to disturbances. This paradox, arising from the reef being adapted to historical conditions that are now changing rapidly. The reef connects land and sea, its health depending on what happens in distant watersheds. The reef being affected by human activities far inland, through the water that flows from mountains to ocean. The reef links local and global management actions affecting reef condition, but global climate patterns determining whether local actions succeed or fail. The reef stands at the intersection of nature and humanity, being both wild ecosystem following ancient patterns and being increasingly dominated by human influences that are transforming ocean conditions, the reef's future being uncertain, but its importance being clear. These ecosystems deserving protection, not just for their utility, but for their intrinsic value, their existence being sufficient justification for conservation, regardless of human benefits. And now the coral reefs fade behind your thoughts. We've drifted through 100 quiet truths about these underwater cities, from the tiny polyps building limestone cups to the mass spawning under full moons, from the vibrant colors hiding countless relationships to the whispered warnings about warming waters, from the ancient cycles of growth to the uncertain tomorrow waiting in the depths. You are connected to this world. The same oceans that bathe coral reefs surround all continents. The same carbon dioxide that you exhale dissolves in seawater, affecting reef chemistry. The same sun that warms your skin powers the zooanthellae in coral tissues. The reef's fate reminds us that we are part of Earth's systems, not separate from them, that our choices ripple outward, touching even the most remote tropical lagoons. Tonight, as you rest, coral polyps continue their ancient work, extending tentacles into darkness to capture drifting food, slowly adding limestone molecule by molecule to structures that may outlast human civilizations. The patient builders working through night as they have for millions of years, creating beauty and complexity in warm, shallow seas. They know nothing of the changes coming, nothing of the warming waters and shifting chemistry, simply doing what evolution designed them to do, building reefs that shelter countless lives. The polyps being neither optimistic nor pessimistic but simply present, living their lives in the eternal now, building toward futures they will never see. And you are safe, warm, resting in a world still graced by coral reefs, where polyps still build their limestone cities, where fish still dance among the branches, where the ancient partnership between animal and algae continues, where hope remains that human wisdom will prevail over short-term thinking, where tomorrow might bring the changes necessary to allow these ancient ecosystems to persist, where you can rest, knowing that tonight, right now, somewhere in tropical waters, coral reefs still glow with color and pulse with life, still demonstrate what patient cooperation can achieve, still whisper their quiet message that beauty and complexity emerge from countless small actions, repeated across time. The reef teaching us about persistence, about partnership, about building something larger than ourselves, about legacy and responsibility, about the preciousness of life in all its forms. Sleep now, in a world still blessed with coral reefs. Dream of warm waters and gentle currents. Imagine yourself drifting weightless above living stone, surrounded by colors, carried by flows, part of the ancient pattern, connected to everything. Peaceful, safe, content. If you're still awake, go ahead and watch the next chapter. Sleep well and dream softly. Good night.